Nā rangatira, e hue maine, tēnā tātou katoa. He tangata no te puku o te rauhi o Ngāti Toa Tēnei, no te wahi o ku te puna, I nā re, ko Aotearoa, tuku kai nā tuturo, mauri ore kia tātou. So first thing I was saying there is it's awesome to have the opportunity to be here speaking to people who perform such an important function for New Zealand society. It really is a pleasure to have the chance to work with you. And, you know, I was speaking to someone earlier saying that you're one group I will not complain to about having to get up early for my kids or anything like that. So I'll have to resist that impulse. I was also mentioning that I'm from Wellington, so I'm in the heartland of Ngāti Toa and just acknowledging tribal boundaries and differences there. And normally what you do when you do your mihi or your pipiha is you talk about your mountain and your river, so people can go, oh yeah, I've been there, I can connect with that. On this occasion though, what I said is that my ancestors aren't originally from New Zealand, but that's of no relevance whatsoever when it comes to loving this country and just thinking it's the best place to be and to bring up a family. But probably the most important thing to know about me is that I'm someone who really believes that we want to be the best versions of ourselves possible, whatever that means for each of us, in each of our many and varied roles in life. And I also believe in our great capacity for positive change and growth when it comes to getting better at being that best version of ourselves. And look, I absolutely love working with people in this space because I believe it's the important stuff in life. It's the stuff that's doing what matters. And I know about transformational change and growth. I know about trying to be the best version of yourself. I know about those things because I've studied that. But I really understand that stuff, and I'm really passionate about that stuff because I've experienced that transformational change and growth myself. So these days, my life is a very good life. In fact, my life is better than I ever could have imagined when I was younger because I'd never seen a life as good as my life is now. But I've been in some significantly more challenging places. When I was 18, I was addicted to drugs, I was a high school dropout, I was associated with people who didn't care about my well-being or that of others. I was committing crimes to finance my drug habit. I wasn't making any kind of positive contribution in the world. And when I think about how I ended up in this place, I think a big part of it was that I grew up getting some pretty clear messages around what I thought I needed to be like to be a man, what emotions I should and shouldn't feel, and that I certainly shouldn't feel any emotions I'd associate with vulnerability or weakness, and how I should behave. I also grew up thinking that the measure of a man was his capacity for violence. And when I hit my teenage years and I found myself feeling all these emotions I didn't think I was supposed to feel, I thought there was something wrong with me. I thought there was something broken with me. And so I sought solace in drug use. I got further and further into drug use to not have to deal with those unpleasant emotions, to not have to cope with those stresses and those challenges. And I grew up as one of 4 boys, and we all grew up thinking that at 18 we'd join the infantry, and if we were living the dream, we'd try and get into the SAS. That's what I grew up expecting I'd try and do with my life. And at home, my dad, I'll talk more about him later, he's an awesome dad and granddad, but he is a man of his generation. He just turned 83, and he grew up as a boy in London during the Blitz, during World War II. So he spent his nights living in bomb shelters while the Nazis bombed the city. You know, he had lots of relatives killed in World War II. You know, he lived on rations. It was a pretty tough way to grow up. And like men of his generation, and subsequent generations, he's not that big on unsolicited cuddles and I love yous and I'm proud of yous or any of that sort of modern approach to parenting. In fact, still to this day, if you want to show him you love him, if you want to show him you care about him, manual labour, that's the way to his heart. That's what he wants from you. He doesn't want any of that sort of modern stuff. And for me, growing up in that environment, the one source of potential softness and support for me was my mum. And I think that's often the case. If you reflect on your own parents, most of us will have had one parent who it was just easier to get the love and approval from, the love and support of, and one parent who you had to work that much harder for. In fact, if you're after a deep, penetrating psychological question to ponder from today, when you walk away from here, think about this. Who was the parent who you had to work harder to get the love and approval from? And who is it you thought you needed to be to get that love and approval? And that'll tell you a lot about how you behave now and how you evaluate your life and your choices. Anyway, growing up in that environment, I encountered lots of challenges when I found myself feeling these emotions that I didn't think I was supposed to have. And a big cause of that in my teenage years was my mum being in the process of dying. So it caused me a lot of stress, a lot of pressure, and I wasn't coping well with it, and I got further and further into drug use. And when I was 18, my mum did die, and 2 days later I chose to catch up with a drug dealer. And what I didn't realise when I chose to catch up with them was that they had an aggressive interest in adolescent boys and sex acts. And what they didn't realize when they chose to catch up with me was that I was someone who had spent my whole life fighting. You know, violence was my comfort zone. It's how I solved all of my problems. Not only that, but I was someone who had experienced sexual abuse myself when I was younger. And as a result of that, I did what a lot of kids do when they experience any kind of sexual abuse, and that is they blame themselves and they think it was because of them. They think it was because there was something wrong with them. Unfortunately, a lot of us as adults who have experienced that kind of stuff still carry that sort of shame with us. Whereas the reality is what we should feel is disgust in the actions and the betrayal of someone who's in a position of power over us when we're children. But I grew up thinking it was about me not being a man enough. I should have been able to stand on my own 2 feet. And as a result of that, any kind of homosexual advance was something which I was on a hair trigger for. And what neither of us realized when we made our choices that day was where they would lead us. Before that day was out, he would be dead, and I'd be spending the first night of what would be the next 10 years plus behind bars. And I just want to be really clear at this point. The reason I went to prison, and went to prison for that long, was not because I was a victim of the justice system or anything like that. It was because I chose to go significantly beyond what was required of me in terms of self-defense in that situation. There was a point where I had defended myself and could have let him leave my house, and I didn't. Instead, I chose to end his life. And I'll tell you what, had I been the person who had died that day, people would have picked up the paper the next day and gone, oh, well, good riddance to bad rubbish. That's no cost to the world. Here's someone who's just doing negative things to people. And that would have been completely fair and understandable. Whereas, of course, I've had an opportunity to reevaluate my life and to figure out that's not what was true for me. That's not who I want to be in the world, the person I was then. And I've had the opportunity to change my behavior, whereas, of course, you know, my victim will never have that opportunity. And I just want to be really clear about that, because I don't want you walking away thinking that I was some kind of good person who was just in the wrong situation at the wrong time. I wasn't. I really wasn't. And I tell you what, I remember my first night going into the prison system. So what happens is, if you're arrested and you're not going to get bail, you get held in the basement, in the cells at the basement of the courthouse till the end of the day. And this is so they can do a single transportation to the prison that night when court finishes. And I was in Wellington, so I was going to Mount Crawford. Mount Crawford is like Wellington's version of Mount Eden. It's an old British-style prison. And with old British-style prisons, you don't have cells with bars on the fronts of them, like you see on North American TV, or like you'd see in Peremuremu, which is our toughest maximum security prison. In these old British-style prisons, you just have solid walls, and in the middle of these walls, you have big steel doors for people to get in and out of the cells. And in the middle of these steel doors, you have peepholes, otherwise known as Judas holes, and these are for the guards to walk around periodically and to do a muster, to make sure you haven't escaped, you haven't killed yourself, you know, you're not breaking any rules or anything like that. And I remember arriving in Mount Crawford that first night with everyone else who'd just been remanded in custody. And by the time we arrived, it was about 5:30. And that meant everyone else was already locked up, because the end of your day at high, medium to maximum security facilities in New Zealand is 4:30. That's when you get your last meal and you're locked up for the day. And I remember walking down this wing with everyone else who'd just been remanded in custody. And as we walked down, I remember seeing these eyes staring out of the cells at us. And people kick these big steel doors, and it makes a massive intimidating noise in this wooden wing. And people yell out, "Kill yourself, hang yourself, I'll see you in the morning." I didn't see it this way at the time, but this was going to be an awesome personal development opportunity for me. I am a true believer that adversity is often the catalyst for growth for us. That it's when the chips are down, it's when things have gone wrong, it's when things are hard that we often have the motivation and the opportunity to really think about who we want to be in the world. And in many respects, raise ourselves up to a different level, reach a different level of our potential as a result of that adversity. Now, that's not something that would happen immediately for me, but it's something that would definitely happen through that experience of imprisonment. And I think one of the ironies for me is that it wasn't until I was imprisoned that I started to actually realize that I'd been imprisoned and held back for a long time before I was physically locked up. I'd been imprisoned and held back by my thoughts and beliefs about the world, about who I thought I was supposed to be as a man, how I was supposed to behave, around what my limitations were. Those things had stopped me ever living an authentic or fulfilled life way before I was physically locked up. And it wasn't until I was locked up that I was actually able to start to do some of the work to break free of that mental prison. And I'm going to talk to you about the steps involved in that today. And I call these the 5 steps to freedom. And I'm going to illustrate them through my own experience, but these are human universals that relate to us all when it comes to that ability to really embrace the challenges of life, to strive towards our potential, and to try and have a more meaningful, authentic life for ourselves. And the very first step relates to being born free and recognizing that as newborn babes, we don't have all these self-defeating and distorted beliefs. We're born with a clean slate. But unfortunately, over time, as we grow up, in an attempt to make sense of our experiences and understand our place in the world, we develop these limiting, self-defeating and distorted beliefs. And it wasn't until I was shifted to Peremoremo, to our toughest maximum security prison, that I actually became aware of this and started to really challenge my own beliefs about my own thinking. And I always knew I'd go to Parry. When I went to prison at 18, when I went to Mount Crawford, they didn't send you up to Parry until you're at least 20. It's just too predatory an environment. It's such a violent gang environment that they don't like to send anyone up there who's not at least 20. But I knew that I'd probably end up there as soon as I turned 20. Well, why did I think that? Let's think about this. I went to prison in part because I wasn't coping with the stress and pressure in my life. And as a result, I was doing drugs to escape the emotions associated with that stress, to not have to deal with it. I didn't then end up in prison and go, my life's significantly worse now, I'll stop doing drugs. Quite the opposite. As soon as I arrived in prison, I was doing anything I could possibly get my hands on. Anything that would help me avoid the reality of my situation and escape having to deal with that. And it was a really effective strategy for me in those early years to not have to deal with the reality of my situation. But it was a strategy that wasn't supported by the prison administration. As a result of that, I spent a lot of time in solitary confinement, and I knew as soon as I turned 20, I'd be on the bus to Parry. And so whenever there's uncertainty in front of us, whenever we don't know exactly what the future's going to hold, we feel anxiety, we worry about that as a species. We really dislike uncertainty and change. To give you an idea of how much we like uncertainty and how worrying it is for us, they did a piece of research last year where they gave people 2 options. First option, low intensity electric shock at random. Second option, significantly stronger electric shock right now. People would rather have a stronger physical pain right now than deal with the emotional distress of having something coming at random, the uncertainty of that. We dislike it. We dislike change. We dislike it. Unfortunately, it's such a core part of life, and particularly modern life. And so what I would do to try and reduce some of that uncertainty is anytime anyone would come down from Parry, I'd always ask them, hey, so what happens when you get to Parry? I'd always be like, hey, so what happens when you get to Parry? Sorry, sir, what's your name? Grant. This is not a reenactment with Grant, just to let you know. I don't recognize him from the system. This is just for illustrative purposes. There you go. So I'd be like, hey, so what happens when you get to Parry? And Grant would tell me, oh, well, the first thing that'll happen is you'll go to classification for 3 months. And that's where they'll evaluate, your propensity for violence, gang affiliations, mental health issues, that sort of stuff. And then I was told I will definitely go to C block after that, because C block is the only neutral non-gang block. And I was told under no circumstances would I want to end up in B block, because it was the most violent gang block. And so sure enough, as soon as I turned 20, I was put on the bus to Parry. I arrived there. When I arrived in the receiving office, I was told that classification and C block were both full, but there were some vacancies in B block because they'd just had a riot and moved some people to solitary confinement. And if I had thought Mount Crawford was in any way, shape or form some opportunity for personal development and growth, this would be that on steroids. And, I had sort of adapted pretty well to the prison environment when I went to Mount Crawford actually. But when I got to Parry, I found it just next level in terms of the brutality, in terms of the violence, and I found it really unsettling. It was a situation where I learnt some really good transferable life skills, like how to make a weapon out of glad wrap and a toothbrush. That's always good to know. And also, if I needed to sit down and use the toilet during the day, I better take one of my legs out of my pants. Can anyone guess why that would be? Wouldn't it be great if there was somewhere to run? There's nowhere to run. It's so you can fight, right? So these were some of the things I learned up there. And I had a pretty tough time up there. I was attacked by a gang member in the yard once with a weight bar, and I used to spend every day just waiting to get attacked. and it wouldn't be till lock up at 4:30 that I'd just be able to relax until unlock again the next day. And you know, it was very stressful. But even in an environment like that, you know, there were some beneficial things. And one of those things was the friendship I had with this guy who was one of New Zealand's most accomplished safecrackers. He was a member of what was called the Hole in the Wall gang, and they were very notorious during the 90s and the 2000s for stealing ATM machines, breaking into safes, armed robberies, breaking people out of prison, all sorts of stuff. And this guy was a really smart guy. He was a Mensa member. Are people here familiar with Mensa? For those of you who aren't, it's like a super nerd club you can get into if you have a significantly above average IQ. And he had done the assessments for that, and he had gotten into that. Pretty sure he wasn't on any of their promotional materials or brochures or anything, but he was a smart guy. And I used to spend lots of time in the yard with him discussing the intricacies of his trade. How do you defeat alarm systems, hide from heat sensors and police helicopters? The kind of education you'd hope your tax dollars go on, right? Preparation for release, that stuff. Anyway, one day I caught up with him after another period of solitary confinement, and he asked me a question that would really change my life. He had two objects of unequal weight, and I'm going to demonstrate this today with this piece of paper and this book here, which is Tolstoy's War and Peace, about the Napoleonic invasion of Russia. It is a page turner if ever there was one. And what he said to me is, he said, if I drop these at the same time, which will hit the ground first? And I thought this was the most ridiculous question I'd ever been asked. Obviously, the heavier one's going to hit the ground first. It's heavier. Now, just a heads up for anyone else who was wagging during the discussion of gravity. You're about to have your mind blown. They hit the ground at the same time, right? Because that's how gravity works. I kid you not when I tell you that was like a magic trick for me. You know, I was so blown away by that. He might as well have said, let me just show you how I can walk on the ceiling. You know, it was just such a violation of my understanding of how the way the world worked. And I spent a lot of time that day and that night trying to find heavier and heavier things to drop to see if it was some kind of trick. And this for me came at a really important moment, because when I had gotten to Parry, I had found myself unsettled by what I saw there and the way it related to who I thought I was supposed to be. You know, I'd grown up thinking I was supposed to be some kind of tough guy, some kind of person who could stand on their own 2 feet and not need the support of anyone else and meet any challenge with, you know, aggression and violence. And yet when I came across people who had reached the pinnacle of that goal, I found myself unsettled by them. I didn't relate to it. And on top of that unsettling feeling for me, this experience of being wrong, it really made me wonder what else I might be wrong about. And when I think about the reason I didn't really relate to people who had achieved that ultimate level of brutality and violence, when I thought that's what I was supposed to be like as a man, I think it's because I grew up in a family environment where I knew I was loved. My parents weren't perfect, like none of your parents were perfect, right? But I knew that I was loved. At least most of the time I believed that. And that experience of positive love, I believe that really puts a handbrake on your real capacity for violence and cruelty. And when I came across people up in Parry, the worst people I came across there were people who had never had any positive experience of love. They were people who had had really unfortunate births into families where they experienced every kind of abuse from the get-go, who then ended up in unfortunate foster placements where that abuse continued, then ended up in Borstal, then ended up in prison. And, you know, make no mistake, it's no excuse for bad behaviour having had a hard upbringing. Most people who have that type of upbringing don't go on to be serious violent offenders, but it's hurt people who hurt people. And the people I came across in Parry were people who just had a capacity for cruelty that I didn't relate to, because I'd never been hurt as badly as they had growing up. And this experience of watching these things drop here, it made me think, education and knowing stuff was way more interesting than I'd ever thought. I'd always thought education and knowing stuff was about getting a job, having a career, and I didn't think that was relevant to me to get into the infantry, to get into the army. Whereas now, I started to educate myself. I started to read things. And the type of stuff I started to read was exactly the type of stuff like that book is. Classic Russian realism. You'd be amazed at what gets donated to prison libraries. It's not actually generally the bestsellers or the easier reads. It's the things that people buy with the best intentions and then realise they're never going to get around to reading, and so donate on. And so I'd read books like this. And when I say read books like this, I didn't really have the literacy levels to read something like that. So I'd have a dictionary next to me and I'd be going through it, sort of deciphering it, but I had the time for that. And my favorite Russian author who I'd read was a guy called Solzhenitsyn. And the reason I loved reading him is because he wrote a collection of books called the Gulag Archipelago on the prison system in the Soviet Union under Stalin. And I'll tell you what, when I was sitting in my New Zealand prison, feeling pretty sorry for myself, thinking my life was pretty stressful, it was incredibly beneficial to read about people's lives that were significantly worse. It really was. What we do as people is we have a natural tendency to compare up. You know, we look at how much better and easier our lives could be, particularly in terms of the things that are causing us stress. We go, if only this wasn't the case, if only this was better, life would be so much easier, I'd be so much less stressed. Whereas I'll tell you, the lesson I learned there is that if the causes of stress are outside of our control, you are way better off comparing down and going, how much worse could things be right now? And that's the perspective that helps you maintain your resilience and your effectiveness, not comparing up, but comparing down. And that experience made me interested in studying psychology more formally. And at the time, I thought psychology would be like mind-reading skills. I thought if I studied some psychology stuff, I'd be like a mind reader. 3 psych degrees later, I haven't come across anything that interesting, but that's what I thought. And I enrolled in a couple of papers through Massey University, not because I thought I could study at university level. I certainly didn't. I'd been held back a year at school. I'd never attended basically from 3rd form. You know, I didn't have any connection with education. I didn't see myself as someone who could achieve an education. But Massey were the only place that offered psychology from a distance. So I enrolled in a couple papers through them. And I enrolled to try and understand the world out here. But very quickly that spotlight turned within. And the greatest value I found from that stuff was understanding my inner world. And one of the things I found most interesting and most liberating was some of the self-defeating and distorted beliefs that people have. So this is not a comprehensive list by any stretch of the imagination. This is just some of the ones that I relate to and some of the more common ones. One of the things I found when I started studying psychology is that everyone who has a normally functioning brain has self-defeating and distorted beliefs. I'd been walking around all this time thinking that this negative self-talk and all these unpleasant emotions meant there was something wrong with me, something broken about me. And now I realize that it's something wrong and broken about all of us. It's a species-wide thing. The only difference is which self-defeating and distorted beliefs apply to you. I'd highly recommend, if you don't relate to any of these ones, to go home later on and Google most common self-defeating and distorted beliefs and figure out which ones most apply to you, because then it's much easier to notice when you're talking to yourself in that way and to choose to ignore that voice, to choose not to be held back by it. Once you've identified which ones apply to you, figure out which ones apply to your partner and tell them about that. Because people love that stuff. Just for those of you who weren't paying full attention, that was a joke. Don't do that. People don't love that stuff. Let's have a look. I need everyone's approval to be worthwhile. I can't tell you how many bad decisions I made in my early life from wanting to be accepted and wanting to belong with groups of people who didn't have my best interests at heart. But that need, that need to be approved of, that need to be seen and valued, by my peers. Unfortunately, they were really antisocial peers. And I'm in my 40s now, and I wish I could tell you, I don't care what people think of me anymore. But I do. Look, I still want to be liked by people. I want you to like me. If that made you cringe a little, but imagine saying it from this position, right? And it's tough because I know whenever I speak to a group this size, there's always going to be people in the audience who will not be able to get past my behavior at 18. And that is completely legitimate. If you've been a victim of violent crime or had that in your life, it's completely legitimate that you can look at me and not be able to get past that and not like me. I completely understand that. And I'll tell you what, it actually makes it a little bit difficult for me standing up and talking about this stuff. But I choose to do this because I believe this is doing what matters. This is a redemptive opportunity for me to try and put some positivity back in the world, to try and do something that might matter for someone else. But it's a challenge because, again, I know that there will be people who don't like me because of my background. It's not just a theory I have. I was waiting to be introduced at a conference a while ago, and I was waiting up against the back wall, and it was after a break, like today, people coming in. And a group of people walked past me and they didn't know who I was, and one of the women said to one of the guys, "Where shall we sit?" And he said, "Not too close, he's a killer." And I was like, because you want to be sort of buoyant before you get up and do this stuff. I tell you what, my wife's awesome. She's so supportive. She said to me recently, she said, "Look, you shouldn't assume people don't like you because of your background. There are lots of reasons not to like you." Here's another one, the shoulds. I should, they should, the world should. The person who started this area of study said whenever you use the term should about yourself or other people, you're shoulding all over yourself and other people. And the reason for that is you're talking about some ideal world that complies with your reality, your preferences, your values. A really common one for women. So I've talked a little bit about my upbringing as a man. I shouldn't feel any emotions I'd associate with vulnerability or weakness. A common one for women is I shouldn't express any emotions that make other people uncomfortable. I should put everyone else before myself, right? This is, in terms of the well-being stuff, there's already been discussion around that, right? The link between diet and well-being. Think about this in terms of the shoulds. This is like an oxygen mask scenario for you in your life, right? If you think you should put everyone else before yourself, you're not going to be able to be in the position you want to be who you want to be for everyone else. You need to look after yourself first, but that's such a common one for women that they just burn themselves out and just sacrifice themselves in their own ability to be who they could be for others. It's a real challenge, the shoulds. And what I'd say to you is self-monitor over the next few days. When you notice yourself using the term should, ask yourself, is this currently enhancing my well-being or making me more effective? And if it's not, it might be something you want to edit out of your vocabulary. And I know this stuff. I have to work on this stuff myself. When I was dealing with my 4.5-year-old this morning, I said, he should listen to my instructions. I was significantly more frustrated by him than when I said, I'd prefer it if he listened to my instructions. So it's a little one to self-monitor on. Here's another one. I must always succeed, never fail, or make a mistake. Put up your hand if you have perfectionist tendencies, if you really don't like to ever fail or make a mistake or get things wrong. If you didn't put up your hand in case you got this wrong, probably need someone for an individual intervention during the break, right? Now you understand that these are not realistic ideas and expectations of yourself. I do a lot of work in the anti-bullying and harassment space as well, particularly in the legal sector recently. Thanks to Russell McVeigh and all the stuff that's come out there, there's been a drive by more responsible law firms to make sure they're not places where that stuff's going to happen. But I often think the most frequent bullying that goes on is actually the bullying between your ears. It's the stuff you say to yourself, particularly in terms of these perfectionist tendencies and these shoulds. In fact, if you're like most people, if you spoke to other people the way you speak to yourself, you wouldn't have any friends. You really wouldn't have people who'd want to be around you. And if that's something you relate to, then your takeaway from this talk might be the idea that you notice the next time you're doing that to yourself, the next time you're being overly critical, you're beating up on yourself, you're hurting yourself with all these shoulds, and you ask yourself, what would I be saying to someone else I love and care about right now? Because I bet you it wouldn't be as harsh as what you're saying to yourself. But this is the most common version, some version of I'm not enough, I'm not good enough. And there are 3 areas where you see this. The first area relates to career and achievement in the workplace. It is so common for people to end up in positions of seniority or influence or importance, and then to look around and go, I don't really know what I'm doing most of the time, but everyone else seems to have it sorted. It's only a matter of time before people realize I'm not as talented or as capable as they think I am. It's so common for people to think that it has its own syndrome name. Does anyone know the syndrome? Imposter syndrome. It is so common it has its own syndrome name. But the reason it's so common and the reason we don't realize that is because it's a false comparison we have with other people. It's like being the duck on the water. If you're the duck on the water, you're aware of all this furious activity that's going on under the surface to propel you along. But then you look at all the other ducks and go, oh, they're just cruising. But it's because you don't see under the water for those other ducks. You don't see what's going on. The other areas this relates to, one of them is identity, where you don't feel you're enough in terms of who you think you're supposed to be in the world. So for me, it related to being a man. I wasn't enough of a man. I should have been able to stand up for myself and not be sexually abused. I should have been able to not feel any emotions I'd associate with vulnerability or weakness. All of those types of shoulds had a big influence on me growing up in the poor decision making I engaged in, because I was trying to overcompensate all the time. I was trying to prove to myself that I could be who I thought I wasn't and who I thought I was supposed to be, who I should be. That's what I was trying to do. And in this day and age, I think it's even harder and more damaging for people, because I'm not thin enough, I'm not funny enough, I'm not young enough, I'm not muscly enough, and the false comparisons we have. Think of the things like the social media apps where you have filters that can make your eyes bigger and your teeth wider and make you skinnier and all of these things that give you a completely false idea of how you're supposed to be in the world and a false comparison with others. You know, those shoulds in terms of your identity is another common area. And the third area is relationships. I'm not enough in terms of being who I need to be in a romantic relationship. You know, I'm not caring enough, or I'm not accepting enough, or I'm not compassionate enough, or I'm not forgiving enough, or I'm not loving enough, or whatever it is. And I'll tell you what, if you've been in a long-term relationship and you've been paying attention, you will have felt that you weren't enough at some point in different ways. That's the normal thing. But again, we have all these false comparisons with other people. You know, they did a survey recently, and what they found in terms of romantic relationships, long-term relationships, is that if you go to sleep 2 nights a week asking yourself, what the hell am I doing with this person? You're in a normal relationship. That's what a normal relationship is like. But it's one thing knowing that it's the stuff in here, it's the self-defeating and distorted beliefs, it's the way we view ourselves, the way we view the world that holds us back. It's one thing to know that. It's another thing to actually want to break free of that mental prison, to believe it's possible to do so, and to have the courage to get out of your comfort zone and to risk failure in that respect, to step into the unknown. And I tell you what, I didn't believe it was possible for me to change. I thought I was a certain type of person. But over that first year of study, I realized something about my brain. My brain was like my physical body. If I exercised it regularly, it would get stronger and easier to use. I wasn't dumb, I had just never mentally exercised myself. So over that first year, I got that realization. And I sat the exams for those first 2 papers, and I passed those papers. And I thought, I'm capable of more than I'd previously thought possible. And I thought, imagine if I could get out of here with a degree. Imagine if I could do something that beneficial. Because I had lots of examples of people around me of what my future could look like. I had lots of examples of people who'd done nothing, who'd just been in the revolving door of imprisonment, you know, hadn't been doing anything positive. And I thought, I can keep doing what I'm doing. I can keep smoking drugs. I can keep just doing nothing positive, and then that's going to be my future. And then when I get released from prison, which I figured to be in my mid-30s, that's about the average for the sentence I was on, about 15 years, and I thought, I won't be able to associate with anyone who's a normal person, because if they want to ask me who I am or what I'm about, I've got nothing but this massive wedge of shameful imprisonment, which just creates a massive gap between me and them. So the only people I'd associate with were other people who didn't see crime as a problem, who didn't see prison as a thing to be ashamed of. That's who I'd be drawn to. And I thought, imagine if I could do something positive though. Imagine if I could do something I'd be proud of. Then I'd be able to associate with anyone. If I met you in a social situation and you were like, who are you? I'd be like, I'm a guy with a degree, which I recognize is a pretty strange response, but it felt like a significantly better option than the alternative. And so I decided to try and start studying to change my life. And I'll tell you what, it required a bit of courage for me to do so, because that wasn't the behavior which was consistent with the prison environment. And, you know, it requires a bit of courage to buck the trends, to go against what other people are doing, you know, to get out of your comfort zone, to do stuff you're not familiar with. But the cool thing about courage and the courage required to do that is that it's like a muscle. The more you exercise it, the stronger it gets and the easier it is to use. You know, I think as a society we overemphasize confidence. We say build your confidence. What I'll be recommending to my boys is that they work on their courage, because that gives them the ability to do what they need to do what's right rather than what's easy, regardless of whether they feel confident or not. And confidence comes from action. It comes from exercising that courage. And again, that courage is like a muscle. But it's one thing to think, okay, it's me I need to work on. If I want to change my life, if I want to change my experience, it's not the stuff out here I need to focus on, it's me. It's another thing, as I said, to choose to do something about it, to want to do something about it, but it's another thing, again, to actually make that escape, to turn that dream into a reality. One of the things you hear in prison all the time is, oh, when I get free, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. You know, I'm going to be much better to my family, I'm going to get a job. I didn't wait for some imaginary point in the future where time would be easier. You know, and how many of you do that in terms of your own pursuit of your potential and things that matter to you? How many of you go, oh, when I've got less on, you know, when the kids are older, when I'm less stressed? How many of you are banking on some imaginary point in the future to make a start? Well, I'll tell you what, this is life right here, right now. And the reason I was able to really turn my life around is I didn't wait for some imaginary future when circumstances would be better. I asked myself, what's in my control right now? What are the small steps I can start taking right now that will lead me a long way over time? And I want you to think about this. Small steps, small tweaks right now make a big difference over time. Imagine this. Imagine my hands are two boats sailing along in harmony next to each other. One of them is who you are and one of them is who you could be. And they're sailing along next to each other. If I just change direction by a couple of degrees, just the smallest tweak in my who I could be boat, over time, that small tweak is going to lead me to a really different destination. It's not about the big stuff. It's about the small steps. And I'll tell you what, one of the steps for me as well was recognizing that I'd have to fight for that freedom, that to make real meaningful change, to pursue my potential wouldn't be easy. Let me give you an example. The prison environment isn't really set up for study. When I decided I wanted to study, I then spent 8 months going around asking people for permission to study. And I was told no by everyone. I was told, oh, I can't give you permission for that, you need to see someone else. Prison is an ultra-conservative environment and no one gets in trouble for saying no. So after 8 months of no success enrolling in prison, you know what I could have done? I could have gone, I tried, they won't support me, you know? And I could have felt like a victim. I could have felt like I didn't have any control, like I was trying and I wasn't supported. But that's not what I did. What I did instead is I said, okay, well, what can I try? What is in my control? So when my dad came to visit me, I said to him, look, can you just enroll me through Massey University? Because I bet you when the study materials arrive, whoever's in the receiving office will look at them and go, oh, well, someone must have given them permission for this and let them through. And that is exactly what happened. I was on to my doctorate, my 3rd degree by the time I left. No one had ever given me permission to study. Always, someone assumed someone else must have at some point. And I'll tell you what, if that hadn't have been successful, then I would have tried something else. I didn't allow myself to feel like a victim. I asked myself, what can I do? What is in my control right now? And as a result of that, I was able to start making those small tweaks that would take me a long way over time. But I'll tell you what, the fight's best won are those with allies. You know, we like to have this narrative where you pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. You know, do it by yourself. That's a load of rubbish. We're a social species. We've evolved to collaborate and communicate and connect with each other. And when it comes to pursuing your potential, I'll tell you what, when it comes to success in that kind of area, success is a team effort. It's not something you do by yourself. It's not something you do without support. And for me, the battles won and best one were definitely those with allies. I mentioned my dad. Remember Dad who didn't give me enough cuddles and I love yous and all of that? My dad visited me nearly every weekend for over 10 years. I want you to think about how much value you place on your days off and imagine giving up one half of those days to go into an environment where you're treated with suspicion. You're treated like you've done something wrong to see someone who you love in a situation that you can't do anything about. You know, I only really get it now that I'm a father in terms of how hard it must have been for him. I only really get it now that I know how much you love your children and what that feels like. And he would have to come and see me in those early years, and I'd be on non-contact visits through the glass because I was too high security to have physical contact with civilians. And I'd often have black eyes, broken nose, stuff like that from getting attacked and getting into fights in prison. And he would have to walk away from that knowing there was nothing he could do to make me safe. You know, I get how hard that must have been now. I had no idea at the time. I thought I was a man at 18. You know, I was just dreaming. And I tell you what, sometimes when I talk about my dad, people will say afterwards, oh, you know, your dad must be proud of you in terms of what you've done now, you know, and what you're trying to do with your life. And I don't really think of emotional language like that when I think of my dad, like pride or anything like that. But I'm quite needy, so I thought I'd ask him. And in fairness, I also knew it'd make him super uncomfortable and that'd be quite entertaining. And so I said to him recently, I said, Dad, are you proud of me, Dad? And he said, most of the time. And I said, what are we talking, like 80-20? And he said, oh, more like 60-40. I tell you what, if it wasn't for my dad and his unceasing belief in me and support of me, I wouldn't be here today. He paid for my study out of his pension, right? He sacrificed in terms of his own life and his ability to do what he could do so that he could support me, so that he could pay for my study. And he wasn't the only one who sacrificed for me and who went out of their way for me. Massey University bent over backwards to make it possible for me to study. They changed the rules for my master's degree so I could study entirely from a distance. They said, we'll let you do all of your papers as special distance papers if you can get all of the lecturers agree to take you on in addition to their normal workload for those papers. All of them did. When it came time to do my doctorate, they said, there's no way that you can proceed without face-to-face meetings with your supervisors. My supervisors travelled over 2 hours out of their way in their own time to visit me in the prison for those meetings, so I could have those meetings. I'll tell you what, if there's one thing I've learned, it's that if you are prepared to show that you will do whatever is required of you to make yourself successful, people will bend over backwards to support that and to make that happen. You know, but that required me to move away from this unhelpful and distorted belief I had as a man that I should never need anyone else's support, that I should be able to stand on my own 2 feet. I needed to be brave enough to make myself vulnerable, to ask for those opportunities, to risk rejection and risk no's. But that's one of the things I've come to learn in my journey as a man, and that is courage and being brave and being strong is not about not needing other people or not feeling those vulnerable emotions, but being able to lean into them and own them and accept that that's part of the experience, being able to risk that rejection and still do what I need to do. And that brings me on to the final step, and this is the step that relates to living free and what that means. And I often think of this step like character fitness. Character is a bit of an old-fashioned term these days, but I think it's the thing that we should most strive for in our lives. And character really is about having the integrity and the transparency and understanding of our values to make decisions which are about what is right rather than what's easy. It's about having the resilience to do that when the chips are down, but it's also about having the moral courage to be able to do what's right rather than what's easy. And I think of it like fitness because I think it's something that you don't achieve and then walk away from. I think of it as something that requires constant effort and maintenance. Have any of you exercised and gotten fitter before? Just put up your hands if you've exercised and gotten fitter. Have any of you exercised, gotten fitter, stopped exercising and just stayed fit? It's not the way it works, right? You don't come to this conference and go, oh, well, I came to the conference 2019, invested in myself, self-actualized, became the best version of myself. Now I'm thinking about some cooking classes or something. That's not the way it works. I'll tell you this right now. No one is sitting at the top of their mountain when it comes to being the best version of themselves. No one is nailing it 100% of the time in all situations with all people. It's something which requires constant effort and maintenance. And it requires you to keep it real around what failure means. If you're someone who has those perfectionist tendencies we talked about earlier, then you'll think failure is an indictment, a judgment against you, something to beat up on yourself about. But the reality is, when it comes to being the best version of yourself, when it comes to trying to have the most meaningful life with the greatest well-being, failure is an opportunity to learn and grow. It's an opportunity to come back stronger. And I'll tell you this right now, if you're not failing in this area, then you're not pushing yourself hard enough. You're not getting out of your comfort zone. One of the things that I know and that I've learned is that my goal as a human being in all of the areas that are important to me is not to be good. My goal in the areas that are most important to me as a husband and father is not to be a good husband or father. My goal is to be a better husband and father on a daily basis. And because that is my goal, when I fail, which I do all the time, I just see that as an opportunity to learn and come back stronger. I don't see it as something to deny. I don't see it as an excuse to give up. And I tell you what, because my goal is getting better, not being good, I don't compare myself to anyone else. All I compare myself to, and the only legitimate measure of progress when it comes to who you are as a human being is, who was I yesterday and who am I going to be tomorrow? And long as there's incremental improvement and growth there, then there's real success. So, I don't know about you, but all this talking about trying to be the best version of yourself is actually quite exhausting. Is anyone else tired just at the thought of trying to be a better version of yourself? It's not easy, right? It takes energy, it takes commitment, it takes motivation. Here's a quick question for you. How heavy do you think this glass of water is? In fact, this is what I want you to do. I want you to put some water in your glass on the table. Everyone put some water in your glass. You've got some water there. Try and half fill it. If you've got enough water on your table, half fill the glass. Half fill the glass. All right. Once you've done that, this is what I'd like you to do. I'd like you to hold the glass out with a straight arm, and I'd like you to have a chat with the person closest to you about this. How heavy do you think this glass of water is? So, what I was hoping, it's a bit of a trick question, right? What I was hoping is that a lot of you would be guessing the weight, how many grams you think it is. But have any of you noticed that it's actually gotten heavier the longer you've been holding it out? Because that's the correct answer, is it depends how long you hold it. Now, I'll pop it down, it's not a competition. I can see some of you are super competitive. But this is what stress and pressure are like. If you've been experiencing stress and pressure for a brief period, it's like holding this glass out. You can feel the demand it places on you, but it's not too heavy for you. You still have the discretionary energy left over to be the best version of yourself, to be the most polite, values-driven person that you want to be, the most tolerant person, when you've been holding out for a brief period. And I'll tell you what, one of the biggest, I think, misunderstandings we have in modern society is the idea that stress is a threat to be avoided. It's not. It's a challenge to be embraced. Stress and feeling some demand, like the demand I'm feeling here, is an indicator that you're doing something meaningful with your life, that you're off the spectator seats, that you're in the arena, that you're trying to do something that matters. Stress, from a psychological point of view, relates to anything that places a demand on you, anything that takes energy. And that's the bad stuff, but it's also the best stuff in life. But the trick is you have to be making sure that you're deliberate and disciplined about putting that glass down. Because if you put the glass down, then when you pick it back up again, when you lean into that stress again, it's not too heavy for you. But if you just keep holding that glass for a prolonged period, it will become cripplingly heavy. If I hold this out for a day or a week, I haven't got any energy left over for anything else. Have any of you noticed that when you've been under prolonged stress and pressure, some of the politeness slips from your personal relationships? It's literally that you don't have the discretionary energy left over for that. So one of the challenges I want to put to you from this, if you really want to invest in yourself, then you need to be as deliberate and disciplined about putting the glass down as you are about any other activity that's important to you. So putting the glass down, how do you do that? Well, that would relate to the stuff which is commonly referred to as self-care, right? And there's all sorts of things there. One of the things I want you to walk away with from today is the idea that self-care is not a luxury, it is a discipline. And unless you're disciplined about it, you're not going to be able to be who you want to be in this world. So there's been a lot of work done in the sporting area around this stuff, because it's called deliberate mental recovery strategies. And when it comes to the difference between success and failure in professional sports these days, it really is the mental game. It's about how much focus and energy you can bring to what you need to be doing. And the work out of Australia that's been done in this area by a guy called Dr. Andrew May suggests that there's lots of different things for different people that can help them put the glass down. A common thread that runs through most of them is they're things that get you present. You're in the moment, you're not in your head thinking about later on or earlier on. You're here for life as it's happening right now. You're experiencing this right now. For some people, that's gardening or cooking. Anyone here love to cook and get lost in the process of that? For some people, it's spending time with kids or grandkids. For everyone, it's regularly getting into nature. but not when you're Instagramming about it. That doesn't count in terms of being present, right? For other people, getting a massage, there can be some different things there. But can anyone guess what's the most commonly reported activity where people go, I'm paying attention right now, I'm present for this experience? What's the most commonly reported activity? It's sex. Sex is the most commonly reported activity where people go, I'm paying attention to what's going on right now. Now, I know some of you people who love to cook are like, I'm thinking of dinner later. But for most people, most of the time, that is the most common activity where people go, I'm paying attention to what's happening right now. And I'll tell you what, they haven't done the research, but if you can be regularly having sex while you're in nature, even more points. But the irony is what we tend to do is the busier we get, the more under stress and pressure we are, the longer we hold the glass, and the more we deprioritize those activities, those self-care activities for ourselves, which are actually the disciplines that enable us to play the long game in our well-being, enable us to really invest in ourselves in a way which means that that stress that we experience, that'll be a catalyst for growth rather than something which is damaging to you. But make no mistake, if you keep holding that out, it will become something which damages you and damages those around you. If you put the glass down, then it's part of the formula for unlocking your potential. It really is. The formula when it comes to your own personal development and growth is stress plus recovery equals growth. But if it's all stress with no recovery, it equals burnout. It equals misery, it equals reduced well-being. But make no mistake, you need a bit of stress. Like I said before, stress is an indicator that you're doing something that's important, that matters, and that you're getting out of your comfort zone, that you're striving towards your potential. You know, these days we often think that happiness is the goal, you know, to feel pleasant all the time. You know, the original Greek word that happiness comes from, it didn't have anything to do with that. The original way that the Greeks conceptualized the idea of happiness was the joy and satisfaction you experience as you strive towards your potential. It wasn't anything to do with feeling good all the time, feeling pleasant all the time. And I'll tell you something else about that. You've got a brain that won't let you feel good or pleasant all the time. You've got a brain that has evolved for you to experience misery and suffering on a regular basis, to worry about things. Be liberated by that idea and stop judging yourself on those unpleasant emotions, because that's the way your brain is wired. That's the way it's evolved. Let me ask you this. Who do you think survived to reproduce and contribute to the gene pool? Right? Who do you think that was? Was it, out of your potential ancestors, was it the caveman and the cavewoman that heard the rustling in the bush and went, oh, that'll be something exciting, I'll put my head in there? Or was it the caveman and the cavewoman that heard the rustling in the bush and went, I'm going to be anxious right now and pay more attention? Your brain is literally wired for you to worry. So have no idea that happiness is your goal, that feeling good all the time. Recognizing that and making space for that and embracing those emotions and still being able to be the best version of yourself from investing and putting the glass down. That's the realistic goal to aim for. So just to recap, for me, the most important thing I've experienced in my life in terms of having a life that is so much better than it was, to having a life where I feel that I'm showing up in the world as who I'm meant to be, as the person that's true and authentic for me, the most important step there was recognizing that it wasn't the world out here I needed to focus on and change, it was the world in here. That I was born free, but over time I had developed these self-defeating disorder beliefs, but those could be challenged and replaced. Those didn't have to be things that I was constrained by. The second step was choosing to actually do something about that, having the courage to try and get out of my comfort zone, to risk failure, to do something different, to be vulnerable, and also recognizing that it was possible to change and grow. The third step was actually taking the small steps now that would move me a long distance over time. It was changing the course of direction, just that small tweak by a couple of degrees in terms of the who I could be vessel. It was those small steps that lead you a long way. You've all heard the quote, Rome wasn't built in a day, correct? How many of you have heard the full quote though? Rome wasn't built in a day, but a brick was laid every hour. That is a really different quote. And that's the quote we want to hold on to. But also as well, recognizing that we need to be prepared to fight to make it happen. that anything worthwhile isn't without challenge, isn't without struggle, but the most effective way to overcome those challenges is through the support of each other and being willing to offer and seek that support from each other. And the final step relates to keeping it real around what it means to live free, about the ongoing effort and maintenance that's required to try and be the best version of yourself, to try and have the most meaningful life, and to recognize that your goal as a human being is not to be good at anything, it's to get better. And because the goal is to get better, your only legitimate measure of progress and success is who was I yesterday and who am I going to be tomorrow. And your failures are not judgments against you, they're opportunities to learn and grow, to come back stronger and to get better. So I hope what you've gotten from my talk is that, the potential to radically transform your life is with you always. But you need to choose to be the author of your own destiny, rather than just show up as a character in someone else's story, to choose to write the script of your future yourself. That power is always with you. And I'll tell you what, adversity, challenge, that's often the catalyst of growth and the motivation to do that. So the question I leave you with is, what's your prison? What's holding you back? So thank you.